Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The executive director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Monday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Monday. It is the sixth day of June. It is D-Day. It is the anniversary of D-Day. How could I miss today's date? It is a Monday. We're into the completing the first week of June, and it is a pleasure to be with you on what is shaping up here as an absolutely gorgeous day. I know that elsewhere in the nation there have been severe weather, and we've had our own this weekend. We've had quite a number of rather heavy downpours, but it looks like that's passed, and we're in for what looks like a pretty good week here in southern West Virginia. We're in for a pretty good week, I think, because once again we have every prospect that we will be together here at the Virtual Center each day this week. I do encourage you to take the opportunity of sharing your thoughts and your ideas with us on the phone line that we have set up just for that purpose. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. As we will see in today's program, we're going to be dealing quite a bit with the issue of free speech. And I think this phone line kind of speaks for itself, so to speak, in that the issue is the opportunity that all of us have to be heard and to bounce our ideas and our concerns or suggestions off other people who have many of the same overall concerns we do, and thereby we kind of are exposed to different perspectives and different ways of thinking that perhaps we hadn't thought of. And so ultimately we grow from the experience. And of course, those who hear our ideas for the first time grow as well. So please don't take that phone number lightly. It's there for your benefit. It's there for the benefit of all of us. And we do trust that you'll use it. If you were with us last Wednesday, you'll know that in our second hour, our friend Horst from Taiwan joined us on the phone line. And for the better part of the hour, I thought we had a really rich conversation. I'd like to pick up on that when we begin our program today. Again, I would like to invite you, if you're a little bit intimidated by getting on the air, and yet you would like to share your thoughts and your ideas with me personally, I would love to hear them. I would love to react to them. I'll do that if you send me an email. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. And then finally, I would like to remind you of our Facebook page. It's been there for several months now, and it's getting extensive use. And of course, probably as much use from me as from anybody, because I find myself going to the Facebook page more and more and more. In fact, over this past, since we've been together last Wednesday, I've posted 3 or 4 different things on Facebook, and I want to open today's program by sharing a few of those with you if you haven't checked our Facebook page. But I do invite you to do it, because these are opinion pieces. They obviously are there. I put them there for the purpose of soliciting your thoughts or sharing some things with you that, at least in my mind, provoke some thought, some reflection, some pondering, and I trust that it might do the same with you. And if indeed that does happen, and if you have reflected on these ideas, and you do have an opinion or something you would like to share or to respond to what's on our Facebook page, then I invite you to use any number of avenues available to do just that. There is, I believe, a place on the Facebook page where you can respond or comment on to what you read there. There is also the opportunity to call in on our call-in number when we're on the air. And, of course, there's always my email address if you'd like to just drop me a line and react to what's on the Facebook page. I'll do everything that I can to acknowledge receipt of your email and, if I can, to respond and do it intelligently to respond to it. My email address, again, waobrien906 at gmail.com. And on Facebook, if you are a regular user of Facebook, you know that if you type in facebook.com, you'll come to the homepage, and at the top of the homepage is a search box. And in that search box, if you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will be into our Facebook page, and the most recent postings are there first. Other than the one which is near the top, which talks a little bit about me and a little bit about the Virtual Center. Other than that, most of the most recent postings are at the top, and then gradually they work their way down as new ones are added. I believe over the last several months there are quite a few what I believe are thought-provoking, hopefully thought-provoking points of view or opinions on a number of issues that seem relevant at the time that I indeed undertook the posting itself. I trust that you will agree. I hope you will agree that the issues are worth thinking about. And if you'd like to share your thoughts with me, I sure would love to hear from them. I mentioned that this past weekend or past 3 or 4 days, I've posted a number of things on Facebook. There are a number of things. The very last thing I posted on Facebook, I believe, was this morning, and I posted it. It's a direct response to the presidential campaign, of course, which seems to be getting the attention of most everyone. As we move closer. Tomorrow, of course, is the California primary, along with the New Jersey primary, and a number of others. And it's entirely likely that Hillary Clinton could indeed have the nomination for the Democratic nomination sewn up by the time the polls close in California because of the time delay with New Jersey. Apparently, from what happened over the weekend in Puerto Rico, Hillary Clinton is within 30 pledged delegates of the nomination. She could have those with the closing of the polls at 7 p.m. tomorrow evening in New Jersey. So it is entirely possible that 2 to 3 hours before the polls in California close, Hillary Clinton will have already wrapped up the nomination. On the other hand, that doesn't really demean the significance of the California campaign primary all that much. The reason is it's because of the size of it and the number of delegates involved. It's a significant primary. It's the primary that involves the most candidates of any other state, and understandably so, given the size and the population in California. But more important than that, it is related to the issue of momentum. And I think many of the pundits agree that even if Hillary Clinton does wrap up the nomination and lose the California primary to Bernie Sanders, the psychological aspect of that will be quite negative. It would give Bernie a tremendous boost going into the convention, and it would create quite a psychological burden on Hillary as well. So I think the issue, of the campaign, at least the Democratic campaign in California tomorrow, is significant. As far as the Republican Party is concerned, of course, that nomination it has, in theory, been sewn up by Donald Trump. But yesterday on the talk shows, of course, the election was getting most of the attention. That, along with the passing of Muhammad Ali at the end of last week. And I know that many of us have spent the weekend looking at film and listening to interviews and all of that related to Muhammad Ali's life, as well as his passing. And I don't think that that we ought to let that pass without at least a moment of reflection. The funeral will be this Friday in Louisville. The turnout is expected to be huge. One of the people speaking at the service will be Bill Clinton, and so I think all week there'll be some attention to the life and the legacy of Muhammad Ali, and even that made its way into the presidential election over the weekend because Donald Trump made a statement about a very positive statement about Muhammad Ali, and it was immediately responded to by both Hillary and Bernie Sanders, charging that the statement was a little bit hypocritical, given what Donald Trump has said about Muslims and about his desire to ban Muslims from the United States. And what they, of course, what they were obviously doing is pointing out the contradiction between that position and the very positive comments about Muhammad Ali. But even more than that, it seems to me, in terms of the current election. Yesterday on ABC News, George Stephanopoulos' guest, one of his guests, was Mitch McConnell, President of the Senate, and if not the real head or a real head of the Republican Party, clearly one of the two or three major people in the Republican Party, along with Paul Ryan and now, of course, Donald Trump. But anyway, the question that George Stephanopoulos posed to Mitch McConnell related to Donald Trump. More specifically, to Trump's incessant attack against the judge who is hearing the Trump University case. Trump's position is that because this particular judge is Hispanic, it's important to realize that doesn't mean that he was born out of the country. He was born in Indiana, and I think that's significant. But he is Hispanic. And Donald Trump's position is, because of the campaign, because of the whole issue of building the wall and all the rest of it, his position is that this judge is not going to give him a fair hearing in the Trump University case, and that therefore this judge should recuse himself from this particular case. And of course, a major focus of conversation this weekend focuses on the racial aspects of that particular comment. To assume that a professional, a judge, can't do his job because he can't separate his duty from his ethnic background, from the fact that he is Hispanic, and therefore could not reach a fair decision based on the evidence, one that was not biased, one that was not prejudiced, is, in the eyes of many people, a racist comment. It goes all the way back to the traditional ideas about race, that many people believe that you can't make pronouncements on particular issues unless you actually have lived them. You can't make comments about the way other people stand on particular issues unless you've walked in their shoes, so to speak. I always used to say when I was teaching, the implication of that particular position is you really don't have a right to express your opinion on the death penalty unless you've experienced it, unless you've been the recipient of capital punishment. Obviously, that's absurd. But that's the position many people take. That's the position that Donald Trump is taking. The implication being that the fact that this person is of Hispanic descent is the most important factor in his reaching a legal decision. That obviously demeans and dismisses the quality and the character and the professionalism of the individual, involved. And it kind of suggests an inability of people to separate one thing from the other. And of course, the pundits have been pushing this issue all weekend long. And most specifically, pushing it from the perspective of the Republican Party establishment, the mainstream of the Republican Party. That brings us back to the interview between George Stephanopoulos and Mitch McConnell. Stephanopoulos' question was, how is it or why is it that the leaders of the Republican Party refuse to call out Donald Trump for the racist implications of his pronouncements on this particular judge? Stephanopoulos' position is that by not responding, by not saying anything, by keeping silent, the leaders of the Republican Party are, in effect, falling into line and rendering, by default, support for the racist nature of Trump's comments. And so the argument of Stephanopoulos, which I think was quite well put, is asking Mitch McConnell, as president of the Senate and a leader in the Republican Party, how do you reconcile the party of Lincoln not taking a principled position on the issue of racism, of all things, by calling out Donald Trump, at least on this issue? McConnell's comment or response to that was very revealing. It was as follows: the party of Lincoln seeks more than anything else to win back the White House, unquote. I couldn't resist making a comment or two on that response on Facebook, and I did that this morning. It seems to me that there's much more involved in McConnell's response to Stephanopoulos' question than election politics. It seems to me what it does is tie the party of Lincoln, these are Stephanopoulos' words, not mine, tie the party of Lincoln to the racist comments of the Republican Party presumptive nominee. And if the Republican Party doesn't separate itself from those comments, then it is in fact an endorsement of those comments. Even more particularly, it seems to me McConnell has made very clear that the number one priority of the Republican leadership is to win elections. And all the talk about principles, about what the party stands for, about the party's commitment to individual freedom, about the party's commitment to ethics and morality, about the party's commitment to equality of opportunity in America. All of these things, it seems to me, Mitch McConnell made the point, are insignificant in the face of the need to win this election. In other words, when push comes to shove and the party's victory is at stake, principle means nothing. What that meant was, in effect, we stand for nothing other than winning elections. Many of us, and I include myself in that, many of us have alleged that for a long time. But I thought it was particularly relevant, particularly significant, that Mitch McConnell, of all people, admitted it. I think that's extremely significant because it tells us where McConnell's head is, and it suggests to us that his head is in the same place that other leaders of the party. On Facebook, I projected that over the next couple of days, the party leadership would make an effort to distance itself from these particular comments by Donald Trump. Because not doing it, not taking a stand, is, it appears, beginning to come at a significant cost in terms of brand, in terms of PR. I think the party has reached the point where it really can't do anything else except distance itself from these comments. But I would suggest to you that it's a little bit little and a little bit late. I think the point has been made. And I hope that people will take the comments by leaders of the party like, well, Newt Gingrich, as from what I understand, has already done that. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Paul Ryan did it as well. Paul Ryan suggesting that he really didn't quite understand what Trump meant there, because this is not something that the party stands for or that the party believes in and all of that. I mean, this is a rather feeble, half-hearted attempt to restore a bit of credibility to the principles of the party of Lincoln. But I would suggest to you, McConnell and the others over the weekend probably did more damage to those principles and to the party's willingness to stand up for them than anything else. I sure would love to hear your comments on that. And again, I invite you to go to Facebook because it's on there. Or if you'd like, by all means, feel free to pick up the phone and give us a call here while we're on the air. We're on the air now for the next hour and a half. So again, the phone number is 304-663-4676. Two other items that I really was moved to discuss on Facebook this weekend. Both of them applied, or both of them dealt with the issue of education. One of them, education in theory, the other one, more specifically, higher education and the funding of higher education. Let me do that one first. I obviously was writing from the perspective of where I live, which is in West Virginia. And I won't go into all of this, except because we've covered it in recent programs, except to say that the state of West Virginia is facing for it a humongous budget deficit in 2017, in excess of $240 million. And the legislature has been meeting in special session for the last 3 weeks, trying to come up with some sort of a budget, which is the legislature's principal responsibility each year in its 60-day session. This year, in the 60-day session, under the new leadership of the Republican-controlled legislature here in West Virginia, the body was unable to come to a budget and come up with a budget and adjourned without one. And the governor promised to bring them back into special session for the express purpose of coming up with a budget. And for the past 3 weeks, the legislature has been in special session, but up until the very last minute, last Thursday, there didn't seem to be any basis or any possibility that this legislature could agree on anything. And then seemingly at the 11th hour, last Thursday evening, the legislature's special session adjourned, having sent a budget proposal to the governor. Over the weekend, the governor promised to veto that budget, that proposal, and probably has already done that today, Monday. The reason? Because the prospective budget really dodged most of the major issues that were holding back the kind of agreement necessary to formulate a real budget. Rather, most of the deficit, 218 of the $240 million, was projected to be taken out of the state's so-called rainy day fund, a multi-million-dollar fund set up in previous years in order to enable the state to meet fiscal crisis. Many people believe that this is a fiscal crisis. I do. I'm one of those. But the fact of the matter is the governor said to tap that rainy day fund and plug the deficit with money from that fund, which is one-time money. Once it's spent, it's gone, and not address the issue of revenue for the future would create a situation where in 2018, 2 years from now, the legislature would be looking at a projected budget deficit of well over $300 million. So in effect, to tap the rainy day fund for most of this year's deficit, projected deficit, would, in a sense, do nothing but kick the can down the road. It would dodge the issues, all of them. It would dodge cuts in government spending. It would dodge the issue of generating new revenue. It would dodge the issue of taxes. It would dodge the issue of layoffs of public employees. It would dodge the issue of a projected budget for the health care of state employees and retirees, and that includes me, a deficit of about projected $120 million. So by tapping the rainy day fund, all of those issues would temporarily be addressed, but only temporarily. They would still be there, and they would rear their ugly heads again when 2018 came around and it was time to debate yet another budget. So based on that particular issue, that particular background, I felt moved to put on Facebook a link to an article which appeared in the Chronicle of Higher Education at the end of last week. And it focused specifically on higher education. And it focused particularly on the state of Illinois. Basically, the title of the article, it seems to me, reveals the severity of the issue. The title of the article is the following: While politicians fight, public colleges in Illinois are collapsing. The reason I put a link to this article on Facebook, on my Facebook page, and I believe on the Virtual Center page, at least I believe I did, is because the budget crisis here in West Virginia is going to affect higher education as well. That's been one of the major concerns. What it's going to do to budgets for colleges and universities. What it's going to do to scholarship programs for students. The situation in the state of Illinois becomes informative and educational because Illinois has been going through a similar budget crisis for over a year. And the inability of the leaders in that state to come to some sort of a compromise on a budget has resulted in the fact that many of the colleges and universities in the state of Illinois are already experiencing the tough times that here in West Virginia we're only projecting we will face if the budget situation is not resolved. I thought it would do well for folks to read this piece from Illinois in order to get some idea of what we were looking at if we didn't get our own fiscal house in order. Here's what I wrote. None of us have crystal balls that really work. We can guess, we can prognosticate, we can ponder, and we can reason. We can lay out all the options, and work to eliminate all the variables from the bottom up. But ultimately, when it comes to issues we have little control over, we have little choice but to cross our fingers and hope that the future turns out all right. For many of us, we can pray. As West Virginia's budget impasse drags on, halted only temporarily by agreement on a budget that really isn't, we find in the New York Times, I think I said the Chronicle of Higher Education, it was originally from there. This particular one I got out of the New York Times. We find in the New York Times a glimpse into what our future might look like, at least where higher education is concerned. This story on Illinois' budget impasse is informative, for it details the state's inability to reach agreement on a budget that has gone on for an entire year. All of us can begin to get some idea of what we might be in for here in West Virginia, at least as far as our colleges and universities are concerned. What stands out so dramatically in this account, by the very fact that it's not there, is the total absence of any sense that a college education matters to the state or the quality of life it delivers to its citizens. Let me repeat this. I think this is the key. While all the conversation, all the focus of attention is on budgets, lost, totally overlooked, is the value of education itself. What stands out so dramatically in this account from Illinois, by the very fact that it's not even mentioned, is the total absence of any sense that a college education matters to the state or to the quality of life of its own people. There's plenty of concern here for what political impasse in that state's capital is doing to individuals. There's quite a bit in the article about what's happening to prospective students and their parents, many of whom are working multiple jobs to help provide educational quality or educational opportunity for their own kids. What's missing, however, is any indication at all that an educated citizenry has real value to a state, that it's a positive good for everyone. Then I've said there's some need for reflection here. We need to stop for a moment and think about this. In part, because we're facing the very same situation here in West Virginia. What's been allowed to pass through our fingers is a kind of faith in the power of education that led to the creation of institutions like the University of Illinois and West Virginia University in the first place. I'm thinking going all the way back to the Morrill Acts in 1862, when the South left the Union and the free states that were left in Congress no longer were facing a veto by Southern states, and in fact were able to pass the kinds of pro-growth, pro-economic development legislation that up to that time was being blocked by an agrarian, slave labor-based South. There was a time, let's not forget, when taxpayers en masse were willing to put their money where their mouth was when the issue was education and the nation's future. Without equivocation, budgets were developed with the needs of education first, not last. When there was a realization throughout society, even among those whose children were least likely to ever set foot on a college campus, that the nation's future, their own children's future, depended on quality higher education institutions, staffed by dedicated instructors and public servants, all committed to the future of the state and the nation. When these assumptions held sway, when full-funded educational institutions were a given in every state, politicians had only one choice: do what the people expect you to do. How dramatic is the change? How much has changed? Now we see ideologues who sign pledges not to raise taxes under any circumstances, whatever the cost, however serious the crisis. Whatever that pledge might do to people, their children, other people's children, or to the future of the state. We see elected representatives of the people convinced that they know what's best for citizens more than the citizens themselves do. We see party hacks, politicians, funded by unnamed donors and out-of-state interests, none of us know, who have sold out our best interests and those of our children for what Scripture tells us was a mere 40 pieces of silver, in order to get money for their next campaigns. These people have been willing to sell out their souls, in effect, to sell out their states, sell out the people of their states, sell out the children of the voters and taxpayers in their states, and jeopardize the best interests and the future economic development of their states by pulling the plug on quality higher education, when in fact history tells us, research tells us, that it's a well-educated population that is going to lead our states and lead our nation into profound recovery. We see party leaders willing to manufacture crisis, cost working people their jobs, jeopardize a state's ability to borrow money in the public interest, because they've convinced themselves that government is best if we shut it down, and that what previous generations believed was the right thing to do was wrong. How arrogant, how dangerous, how dishonest, how bold. No longer can we continue to sit back and let others make decisions for us. It's late, but it's not too late to take back our state. Obviously, this is a column, this is a posting on Facebook that I feel very deeply about. I obviously am a candidate for public office next November. Obviously, then, this idea of taking back the state implies or suggests replacing those in power with a whole new group of people committed to doing the will and promoting the best interests of the state and its people. So obviously, I have an interest, a vested interest in this. I will not deny it. The fact of the matter is, however, there's no question that as somebody who has spent more than 50 years in higher education, it pains me deeply not only to see what is happening to education, but to see almost the total lack of any appreciation, any sense that what we do to education matters. In fact, increasingly, there's almost a counter campaign to suggest just the opposite, to suggest that it doesn't matter, and to suggest that if we lose a few colleges here and there, and we reach a point where certain people can't afford to go to college, so be it. And what I'm saying is, what happened to the assumptions and the thinking of previous generations, which were committed to the idea that educational opportunity was the key ingredient of economic opportunity in this country for citizens. And citizens who came from backgrounds that were not considered upper class or even middle class presumed that education was the most available way that they could climb up the ladder. It was those kinds of assumptions that caused taxpayers to support higher education in this country to the point that this nation has celebrated, has featured the most high-quality higher education systems in the world. People from all over the world continue to come here and send their children here and pay top dollar, pay top dollar for what they perceive to be the best education available anywhere. And yet, for fiscal reasons, we're comfortable denying those same opportunities to our own citizens. Not only do we deny them the opportunities, but we seem almost oblivious to the extent to which education is the key to realizing those opportunities. That's one of the entries that I put on Facebook. Obviously, I would welcome and solicit responses, and I know there would be many. This piece focuses principally on higher education, but obviously the kind of budget deficit we're talking about is going to affect K through 12 education at all. Here in West Virginia, the projections are that if we don't reach a meaningful budget solution, we're looking at layoffs in higher education of in excess of 350 faculty members. In public education, we're looking at the elimination of a significant number of teacher positions, staff positions, administrative positions, all of it. So it seems to me that with these things looming in the background, the more ideology stands in the way of solution to the fiscal problem, the more frightening the situation is. It's one thing for people to not necessarily be able to agree on everything. The fact of the matter is, if they're looking for solutions and they agree on the need to find solutions, they will find them. But when you have people that have dug in their heels ideologically so firmly that they're willing to shut down government, shut down institutions and systems totally, because of what they believe ideologically, it's frightening. And as I mentioned, that's what we're looking at, not only here in West Virginia, but obviously in Illinois as well, and in a number of other states as well. And I've read all sorts of things about what's going on in Kansas under Governor Brownback and all the rest of it. For some time, the Kansas budget model was seen as the driver for a more conservative, fiscally lean approach to state government. And from everything we read now, Kansas is in dire situation, budget-wise as well. So that's one of the pieces that I put on Facebook this particular weekend. And it was associated with a link to this particular article from the New York Times on higher education in the state of Illinois. The other piece that I put on Facebook more recently is much more philosophical. I don't know what got me into this, but suddenly I found myself into it. I found myself writing it, and I thought, well, I'll share it. It's not that long. But at the end of it, I thought, this is pretty good. At least for me, it kind of says many of the things I believe. So I'll put it on Facebook and give other people an opportunity to react to it. And that's what I did. So here goes. Remember the adage about the forest and the trees. Until each of us takes a step back and invests the cognitive time needed to embrace the forest in its totality, the true essence of each tree remains unknown. I think I've worded that in a way which may require some elaboration. It's based on the idea, we've talked about it many times here in the Virtual Center, that oftentimes our people have problems standing back and conceptualizing the meaning of the whole, of the totality, because they become so focused on the trees of the forest that they lose sight that each tree is part of a forest. And it's really the forest as a whole, as an entity, that carries the meaning and the significance. These trees do not stand in isolation one to the other. Rather, they are part of a forest. And if at some point in time we don't take cognizance of that, if we don't stop every once in a while and stand back, stop for a moment, and begin to look at how the details really make up something bigger, then we're missing an awful lot. That's really my point. The idea of the forest and the trees. Until each of us takes a step back and invests the cognitive time, the brain time, the logical time, the reasoning time, the thinking time needed to enhance, to embrace the forest as an entity in its totality, then the true essence of each tree remains an unknown. Presumed by most people to be exclusively a cognitive exercise, most people believe that this whole process is a rational one, is a logical one, is a head problem, is a brain problem. Traditionally, academics, scholars, refer to this search for context as critical thinking. This is what critical thinking is. This is what analysis is. The ability to see how the individual pieces fit together to form something larger. In other words, using the information available to create meaning by linking the pieces together. This is what people call critical thinking or analysis. A key point. Through it all, politicians continue to provide us endless proof that meaning will change when context is recognized. Take a comment or an act out of context, and it seems always to become new news. How many times do we see politicians take a comment or a phrase or a quote out of context, change the entire meaning, but at the same time accurately be able to pin it on the person who uttered it or the person who wrote it? What I'm suggesting here is that meaning and context go together. What a person says or what a person writes can only accurately reflect what the author meant when context is taken seriously, when context is considered. If you take things out of context and look at them isolated all by themselves, you lose a significant aspect of the meaning. Not only that, but it gives you the opportunity to create your own meaning, because you have successfully eliminated the person who originally wrote it or spoke it from consideration. No longer do you have to worry about their meaning. Now you're free to create your own. And that's what our politicians do all the time. And so when we talk about one of the major challenges in our education system at all levels, it relates to the issue of context. The ability to take the facts, take the information, and be able to find ways that it connects into something bigger. Find ways that things relate. Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, showed us a different side to what we thought was cognitive only. We thought that the search for context was a brain exercise, was a matter of logic or reason or common sense or analysis or manipulation or critical thinking or whatever other term you want to use. All of these are brain-related terms, head-related terms. But we know here at the Virtual Center from reading and thinking about Jefferson over the years that Jefferson, in one of his more famous letters, talked about the difference between the head and the heart, talked about the extent to which they connect, how one directs the other, and how important it is that they interact together. I would suggest to you, this goes back to our programs last week, I suggest to you that looking only at the cognitive part, only at the brain part, only at the head part, the analytical part, without any relation, without the heart, without conscience, without any sense of right and wrong, good or bad, what you are into is thinking the way a psychopath thinks. Psychopaths, by definition, have no conscience. They don't care about morality or ethics or right or wrong. They don't care about how things look or whether, in fact, things violate principles or not. They just look at what's best for them, and if it makes sense, they do it and worry about the consequences later. That's classic psychopathic behavior. And if you look at the process of linking specifics to the general, to the overall meaning, linking the trees to a forest, then it seems to me you're missing a good part of what makes human beings human. Emerson, more than anybody else, I believe, shows us that human side. He shows us that what we thought was a cognitive exercise only has a human side as well. He termed it the oversoul. If you go online and you Google Ralph Waldo Emerson's Oversoul, you will gain access to a copy of one of the most important essays that Emerson ever wrote about the Oversoul. And this is the way he defines the Oversoul as, quote, that unity within which every man's particular being is contained and made one with all other, unquote. In other words, Emerson's thinking is that just as each tree is part of something bigger called the forest, each individual person, each human being is part of, a component of something bigger called humanity. He calls it the oversoul, the unity or the linkage that connects all of us. This is Emerson's thinking. It obviously is very Eastern. If you are at all familiar with Eastern philosophers, with Oriental philosophers, Asian philosophers, they were very, very much into this idea of unity that Emerson talks about. Emerson goes on in his essay on the Oversoul and says the following: it's when man begins to appreciate how he connects to something far bigger than himself that he begins, and this is the quote from Emerson, he begins to speak from his character and not from his tongue, unquote. In other words, what Emerson is saying is when man begins to appreciate, to realize that he's part of something bigger, then what he says begins to matter much more, because it comes from within. It comes from down deep. It comes from his character rather than from his tongue. It's not a superficial, meaningless collection of words, but what man says has substance and meaning and gravitas, if you will. Emerson explained, when what man says is transformed from mere words that are one-dimensional into, quote, wisdom and virtue and power and beauty in a much different world, a world that is multidimensional. The one-dimensional, multidimensional, those are my words. The wisdom, virtue, power, and beauty, those are Emerson's words. In other words, the substance of what man says and the importance of what man says becomes much more significant when that man has realized that he's part of something much bigger than himself. What he says ceases to be one-dimensional and becomes multidimensional. Back to education. It's when this realization happens, when that light goes on for a particular student, that real education begins to happen. When students begin to connect, when students begin to see the connection or see the relationship between up until then had been isolated facts, education begins to happen. And this is me after 50 years talking. For too many of our students, it never happens. The light never goes on. For them, there is no forest. There never will be. Only trees, trees, trees. Or going back to Charles Dickens in Hard Times, if you remember the school teacher in Hard Times, Mr. Gradgrind, facts, facts, facts. It's here, in this kind of shallow make-believe environment, where short answer tests were born, where multiple guess continues to dominate, where true-false options define what's promoted as a reality, a simplistic either-or world that isn't. In other words, when we teach this way, when we just teach this tree, that tree, another tree, and we don't encourage students to take the time to see the relationship, to see the forest, so to speak, then the way we test student progress, student educational progress, development, is in short answer, multiple choice, multiple guess, true-false questions. Because all we care about is whether they have mastered the meaningless details related to individual trees. But they have never understood what all of those trees together are about. They have no concept of the forest, no concept of the beauty or the importance of the forest, no concept of the kind of life that the forest supports. Their world is a makeshift, shallow, true, false, multiple choice, fill in the blanks world, which is not real. Consequently, when they get out of school, they're not really qualified to do much because realistically they don't know a hell of a lot. My message: as budgets get tighter, as priorities become more clearly defined, it's critical that we citizens get our own priorities straight. This rather haphazard, slipshod approach to learning will no longer do. Our world here in West Virginia is changing. We must be sure our kids are ready for it. Let's not surrender to cuts, budget cuts, in places we shouldn't. Instead, let's demand that our tax dollars go finally where we really want them to go. Let's know what education is all about, and let's take the shrinking amount of money that's available to fund it, and let's put that money to the use that all of us want and need for our own kids. That's the message. It's one, I don't know where it came from. It's not really related to much of anything that is related to what's been going on this weekend, but it's just something that came from within me, and I took the opportunity to put it on Facebook. And I took that same opportunity to burden you with it here at the Virtual Center. Well, we've gone 5 minutes beyond the top of our first hour. We're late taking our break, as we sometimes are. So we're going to pause for a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back. When we come back, we're going to get into something a little bit more related to what we've been talking about in the past. And for the beginning of the second hour, I'd like to return, or at least get us to reflect a little bit on the conversation we had here at the Virtual Center last Wednesday with Horst. More particularly, let's look at the corporation as defined and explained to us by Joel Bakan in his book about the psychopathology, the psychopathic behavior of corporations. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. This is Bill O'Brien. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break. We'll be right back. Please stay with us. Won't be long. Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to our second hour, albeit a little bit late into it. We're at 9 minutes after the hour. But I do want to welcome you if you are just joining today's broadcast here at the Virtual Center. I want to welcome you. If you've been with us through our first hour, I want to thank you for doing that. And let me tell those of you who were not with us during our first hour that if you look at our Facebook page, most of what we covered during this first hour is based on a couple of entries, a couple of postings that are on the Facebook page. And so basically what I did was read them and go over them in our first hour. So, if you did miss the first hour, then you can kind of pick up where we were by just taking a quick look and scanning a couple of those pieces on our Facebook page. I do welcome you to our second hour, and I do invite you to participate in this program by sharing your thoughts and your ideas and your comments with us here at the Virtual Center. Not only I personally, but those tuned in as well would really appreciate hearing from you and hearing some of the thoughts and some of the ideas that are out there. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to communicate with me via email, and I especially ask you to do that if you have visited our Facebook page and you have a comment or a reaction to some of the pieces that are posted there, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, lowercase, 906@gmail.com. And as we mentioned in our first hour, I do invite you to look at our Facebook page. If you go to the homepage of Facebook, to the search box at the top, and just type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will have access to our Facebook page. Those of you who were with us last week here at the Virtual Center know that we got into some pretty heavy, and I say that advisedly, pretty heavy stuff last week in dealing with the nature of corporations. More specifically, we looked at some detailed reviews of a book written some years ago by Joel Bakan on the nature of corporations and the extent to which corporations reveal the characteristics of psychopaths. And if we think about the nature of psychopathic behavior, if we think about what psychopathic behavior is about, then we can begin to understand what Joel Bakan is telling us. Specifically, that corporations, unlike people, do not have a conscience. They do not have a sense of right and wrong or a sense of morality. Rather, Bakan says, corporations are driven by a commitment principally to their shareholders. Corporations are a form of organization designed principally to raise large amounts of capital. And the way they do that is to attract investors to the profit possibilities and the growth possibilities of the entity, of the corporation itself. Investors invest expecting a return on their investment. By definition, the officials of the corporation are committed first and foremost to make good on those commitments to investors. What this means is, and again, I'm kind of paraphrasing Joel Bakken here. What this means is that all the talk we hear about corporations being good citizens and about corporations developing a sense of community, a social sense, a social conscience, and all the rest of it should not dissuade us from the truth, from the reality of what makes corporations exist. And that is the needs of the shareholders to always come first. It doesn't become a problem when doing things for the community or on behalf of the community at large benefits the corporation and thereby benefits the shareholders. It's when the objectives, the goals of the shareholders and the goals of the community at large are different that corporate leaders find themselves in a quandary. But it's always important, Bakken says, to recognize that whatever the issues, the shareholders must always come first. What that means then is that internally, inherently, corporations are driven by a set of priorities that they can't vary from, that they can't veer away from. What that means is that, like psychopaths, they are focused and driven in one direction and one direction only. And everything that seems not to be consistent with that, the socially good things that many corporations do, the charities they support, and all the rest of it, would seem to suggest that the corporations are putting the interests of the community, the interest of the citizens of that community, ahead of the priorities of the shareholders. But they're not. Chances are a lot of this is public relations, is advertising, is part of the campaign to build brand, so to speak. In other words, always it's the priorities of the shareholders that dictate what corporations must do. If they don't do that, if they don't put the interests of the shareholders first, then the shareholders would vote them out of office. That's part of the corporate charter. That's really the basis. Those are the rules that corporations abide by, accede to, when they are formed, when they are incorporated, when government gives them the benefits of incorporation, things like limited liability and all the rest of it. Consequently, and this we concluded, and this was pretty much the basis of the conversation we had last week with Horst. Consequently, the issue arises about government's right to regulate corporations, to control the behavior and control the activities of corporations. If corporations are created because government believes that they promise to provide a public good, if the creation of a corporation is projected to be to the benefit of society at large, then government feels very comfortable in issuing them the papers of incorporation, the right to incorporate, the stamp of approval, if you will, from the state. Because the assumption is that while we know that this corporation is going to pursue its own self-interest, what we believe is that this corporation's purpose, this corporation's self-interest, is also in the public interest. Therefore, we as representatives of the citizens feel very comfortable in endorsing this corporation as a public good. Bakken's point is then if that's true, then it seems to imply that government has a responsibility to make sure that everything the corporation does, especially since it gave it the license to operate, everything the corporation does ought to be in the public interest, ought to benefit the society at large. Therefore, government, according to Bakken, would naturally presume that if the corporation was doing something or anticipating doing something that was not in the public interest, then government, in the name of the people, should have the right to stop it, or the right to rechannel it, or redirect that corporate behavior into behavior that is more consistent with the public interest or the public good. In other words, there is an implication here that government's right to regulate corporate behavior is inherent in the laws of corporations. But Bakken tells us that over time, corporations have been able to sell government on just the opposite. Corporations have been able to convince government regulators that the corporate best interests are served when the corporation is given its freedom to act in its own best interest. In other words, the shareholders, as well as the public, are better off when the corporation is allowed to operate unregulated, unmanaged by government. Corporations then sell the bill of goods to government, which contains or includes the promise to regulate themselves. They promise to self-regulate. They promise to stay in tune with the public interest. But in exchange, they look to government to not regulate them, not control them too tightly, not tell them what to do. This, Bakken argues, is a contradiction and creates a crisis. Because, and here is the major thesis of his book, if corporations are driven by a set of internal behavior requirements which make them similar to psychopaths, if they can't do anything else but put their own self-interest first, then what in heaven's name makes government or society believe that these corporations can self-regulate? If we're dealing with psychopathic organizations, Bakken suggests, then by definition they must be regulated. Their behavior must be controlled. Because inherently, internally, genetically, although that's not really the proper word, but I think you get the point. if they are intrinsically driven to put their own self-interest first, then the only way to control that is to control them. And Bakken raises the question, who in their right mind would trust a psychopath to self-regulate? Who would support the idea of giving access to weapons to psychopaths who have no conscience, no sense of right and wrong, and look at every situation as an opportunity to benefit themselves at somebody else's expense? If you know that that's what drives psychopaths, why in heaven's name would you even consider giving them the freedom to self-regulate? We looked at a couple of quotes from Bakken's book. This is the first one. The corporation, Bakken says, is an externalizing machine in the same way that a shark is a killing machine. There isn't any question of malevolence or of will. The enterprise has within it, and the shark has within it, those characteristics that enable it to do that for which it is designed, unquote. Bakken argues that a corporation is driven by the same kind of internal mechanism that drives the shark to kill. In the shark's case, it's genetic. In the corporation's case, it's inherent. It's intrinsic. It's internal. And it's invariable. And then Bakken says, this is on page 110 of his book, no one would seriously argue that individuals should regulate themselves, that laws against murder, assault, and theft are unnecessary because people are socially responsible. Yet oddly, we're asked to believe that corporate persons, institutional psychopaths, who lack any sense of moral conviction and who have the power and motivation to cause harm and devastation in the world, should be left free to govern themselves. It's a contradiction, Bakken says, that we have to deal with. And finally, and this is kind of a repeat or review of last week's programs as well, we looked at the Supreme Court case decided by a unanimous Supreme Court under the leadership of Chief Justice John Marshall in 1819, the Dartmouth College versus Woodward case. And in that case, John Marshall addressed the issue of corporations. John Marshall defined them. He explained exactly what they were, what their purpose was, and why government brought them into being. And we looked at that specific detail last week. I'm thumbing through my paperwork here. If you'll bear with me for one moment. Here it is. In Dartmouth College versus Woodward, John Marshall said the following: a corporation is an artificial being, invisible, intangible, and existing only in contemplation of law. It's not a real person. In other words, this is me talking now, not Marshall. It's not a real person. It's an artificial person. It's a person created by the law. Back to Marshall. Being the mere creature of law, It possesses only those properties which the charter of its creation confers upon it, either expressly or as incidental to its very existence. Corporations only possess the properties which their charter gives them. These are such as are supposed best calculated to affect the object for which the corporation was created. And then Marshall addresses two priorities, two properties that corporations must have if they are to survive, and thereby if they are to be successful. He said these properties are such as are supposed best calculated to affect the object for which the corporation was created. Among the most important are immortality, and if the expression may be allowed, individuality. Properties by which a perpetual succession of many persons are considered as the same and may act as a single individual. They enable a corporation to manage its own affairs and to hold property without the perplexing intricacies, the hazardous and endless necessity of perpetual conveyances for the purpose of transmitting it from hand to hand. It is chiefly for the purpose of clothing bodies of men in succession with these qualities and capacities that corporations were invented and are in use. And this is me talking now. Corporations, Marshall says, are creatures of law, and for purposes of convenience, they are given by law the qualities of persons, of individuals. And all the individuals that make up the corporation and the succession of individuals that make up corporations over time are all presumed to coalesce into one person, one artificial creature of law. And like persons, the corporation is given two properties which persons have, namely the right to immortality and the right to individuality. Corporations are given the right by law to provide for their own future, their own survival, their own success. Translation: corporations must be allowed to do what they need to do in order to survive. They must have the freedom and the flexibility to provide for their own future, their own salvation, their own safety, their own security. By implication, then, and this isn't there, it's just implied by what is there. By implication, then, no outside force or entity like government should or can have the right to deny corporations the freedom and the flexibility they need to function, because it's functioning and fulfilling their charter-based commitments that causes government to create them in the first place. The reason government created the corporation as a legal person is because the corporation's reason for existing, we believe, government believes, is in the best interest of the public at large. In order to be able to fulfill that, they need to be able to protect themselves, to guarantee for their own security. Therefore, they must be granted the freedom and the flexibility to do what they need to do. That means they can't or shouldn't be overregulated. they shouldn't be overmanaged. Because if you do that, you're taking away the freedom and the flexibility they need to provide for their own immortality, which Marshall says is inherent in their very creation. We didn't mention this last week, but let's try it here. If you go back to Jefferson's Declaration of Independence and the idea of inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. By implication, freedom. Freedom to act. Freedom to pursue their own best interest. Freedom to pursue opportunity. Freedom to acquire property. Freedom to have that property protected and not have it subject to the seizure of others. What Marshall has done by suggesting that corporations have the right to immortality is to give them the same properties or the same qualities of personhood that Jefferson believed human beings had by their very creation, the very life breathed into them by God. The second property or characteristic that Marshall argued in Dartmouth College versus Woodward, the second property that corporations must have is individuality. Their right to exist as individuals, as unique entities, as legal persons. And again, if you go back to the Declaration and the idea of individualism, the idea of individual freedom, the idea of my rights as an individual, as a person. In effect, what Marshall has done is grant the same qualities to corporations as Jefferson argued God himself breathed into every human being created. Let's stand back for a moment and think about that. In other words, let's do the critical thinking or the analysis that we talked about in our first hour in that little piece from Facebook. Let's step back and look for a moment not at the trees, but at the forest. Let's look at what the grant of immortality and individuality means for the corporation. What Marshall is in effect done is minimize the right of the state to regulate corporate behavior by guaranteeing corporations the kind of personhood that grants them the properties of immortality and individuality. What John Marshall has effectively done is place limits on the regulatory abilities of the state over corporations. In effect, it has given legal credibility, legal credence, if you will, to the idea that corporations ought to be allowed to self-regulate. Bakken tells us, wait a minute, you can't do that because these are psychopaths. You can't let them self-regulate because what they do will not be in the public interest. It'll be in the interest of their own shareholders because that's what they're required to do That's their DNA. That's what makes them tick. So in effect, there's a conflict here. Government's right to regulate corporations versus the degree to which corporations as persons minimizes the right of the state to regulate corporations. And that, it seems to me, brings us back to the infamous Supreme Court case of 2010, Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. A decision rendered by the Supreme Court by the conservative majority of 5-4 in 2010. A decision which took many of the limits off on campaign spending by corporations. Basically, Citizens United basically suggested that because corporations are corporate persons, they are entitled to the same political speech that citizens of the Republic have under the First Amendment to the Constitution. And that to overregulate them, to overmanage them, is to deny them their constitutional rights to immortality and individuality, as explained by John Marshall in Dartmouth College versus Woodward. We know that the major debates over Citizens United revolve around this very question, whether in fact the state has the right to regulate corporations, corporate behavior. By a 5-4 conservative majority opinion, the court in Citizens United decided that the corporation's right to be free of regulation was the only way that their rights as corporate persons to free speech, to political speech, could be operative. We some time ago, here at the Virtual Center, did several programs on the Citizens United decision. The decision as rendered by Justice Kennedy and the 90-page dissenting opinion written by Justice John Paul Stevens. Actually, it was written by Justice Souter. But Souter retired. This was the last decision, or last opinion, last dissent, if you will, that Justice Souter wrote before he retired. And therefore, it is associated with Justice John Paul Stevens. The issue, it seemed to me, resolved around the rights to regulate corporations versus the freedom of corporations. We're kind of approaching the 3/4 point of our second hour. So we're looking at something less than 20 minutes of our program left, about 18 minutes. I kind of think that we'll probably get into a lot of the theory here, a lot of this idea of regulated corporations, a lot of looking at the dissenting opinion of Justice Stevens, as well as the majority opinions, especially the majority opinion written by deceased Justice Antonin Scalia in tomorrow's program, rather than begin to get into them now. What I thought that we might do in our last 12 to 13 minutes of our program today is take this issue out of the classroom, if you will, out of the clouds, out of the realm of theory, and bring it down into the real world in which all of us live and function. Specifically, there's been an ongoing debate in this country for much of its history over this issue of the right of government to regulate corporate behavior. We spent quite a bit of time with this in the late 19th century during the so-called Industrial Revolution, when we had a very conservative Supreme Court that was willing to grant corporations the freedom to pretty much do whatever they wanted to do, and to deny government the opportunity to regulate that behavior. We saw the nation come to the edge of crisis in the 1880s and 1890s. In the context of strikes and protests and radicalism, especially within an organization moved to organize labor, to organize workers, that looked like it was going to bring government to a standstill in the late 19th century. And out of this emerged a movement built upon the theory that government ought to have, should have, and was intended to have the right to regulate corporate behavior. And we know that movement was the progressive movement. We looked at some time ago at a very famous speech delivered by Theodore Roosevelt in 1910 in Kansas, in which Roosevelt laid out his program, part of which was referred to as the Square Deal, if you remember. And what Theodore Roosevelt was talking about was the right of government to regulate corporations in the public interest. So what we have in this society, in our history, is a back and forth competition over the same question: whether government has the right to regulate and direct corporate behavior to serving the public interest, or whether corporations, because they have the mantle of legal personhood, should be treated as individual persons and therefore not subject to this kind of government regulation. That they ought to be free individuals, free to do whatever they need to do in order to fulfill their own best interests as they define them. This debate has been going on for a long time. At times, it has come close to revolution in this country. When FDR was elected president in 1932, running on a campaign in which he was promising the American people a New Deal, without getting into the specifics of what that New Deal entailed, he was talking about the right of working people to work and to organize and to participate in collective bargaining. He was talking about the rights of unions to exist and to flourish. He was talking about the obligations of business to support the best interests of the public. He was talking about the creation of government agencies committed to the regulation of business behavior in order to make sure that the best interests of citizens were served. He was projecting government that would regulate the behavior of banks and investors. All of it to protect citizens so that never again would the nation experience anything as severe as the crash and the Great Depression that was engulfing the nation in the 1930s. There is absolutely no question that in response to Roosevelt's election in 1930, there was, in fact, the makings of a coup employing members of the military. The idea being that there would be a military takeover of the United States in order to prevent the socialist policies of FDR. Many corporations, corporate leaders, were involved in this coup. Much of the evidence for it comes from a retired Marine Corps officer named Smedley Butler. Smedley Butler had been a career military person who was approached to lead a 500,000-man army on Washington in order to take control of the government. The excuse being that President Roosevelt's health was failing. Smedley Butler later decided against this action, blew the whistle on the coup, and it was stopped. And ever since that time, there has been debate in this country as to whether, in fact, the coup was real or whether, in fact, it was a hoax. Much of establishment America, and I use this word very carefully because of what's going on in the current election, much of the establishment did everything that it could do to suppress the reality of this coup. The New York Times wrote an editorial in June of 1933 in which they called it a grand hoax. Many other official publications did the same thing. This coup has disappeared from our textbooks. Our students never gain access to the fact that anything like this even happened. However, there is more and more evidence to suggest that indeed it did happen. There's also an indication that much of the platform, many of the programs being advocated in this current election by Bernie Sanders are very similar to the programs being advocated by Roosevelt during the election of 1932. The regulation of banks, the regulation of investments, government protection of mortgages, government protection of bank accounts, government's protection of workers' right to unionize, organize, and to strike, minimum wage, Social Security. Many of the things that Bernie Sanders is talking about in today's election were the basis of an effort at a coup in the early 1930s. I would suggest to you, in some ways, we're experiencing something similar in efforts to try to bring the Democratic campaign to a close in order to get Bernie Sanders and many of these ideas off the front page. I think it's something to think about. Let me share with you a document. In 1933, Smedley Butler delivered a speech on the projected coup and basically talked about his role as a military officer, his career in the military, and the extent to which he had come to realize that the military was in many ways the agent of corporate America. Here are excerpts from a speech delivered in 1933 by Major General Smedley Butler. Quote, "War is just a racket. A racket is best described, I believe, as something that is not what it seems to the majority of people. Only a small inside group knows what it's about. It's conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the masses. I believe in adequate defense at the coastline and nothing else. If a nation comes over here to fight, then we'll fight. The trouble with America is that when the dollar only earns 6% over here, then it gets restless and goes overseas to get 100%. Then the flag follows the dollar and the soldiers follow the flag. In other words, it's to protect the investments of investors that really lies at the heart of many of the conflicts that this country gets itself into. I think it's very appropriate to look at the ingredients of this speech right now, given the behavior and the career of one Muhammad Ali. I think many of us who can remember Muhammad Ali before he became world champion can realize some of the things that Muhammad Ali did, some of the sacrifices he made in order to stand up against the establishment for principle. That's what, in effect, Smedley Butler is doing in 1933. He goes on, "I wouldn't go to war again as I've done to protect some lousy investment of the bankers. There are only two things we should fight for. One is the defense of our homes and the other is the Bill of Rights. War for any other reason is simply a racket," says Butler. "There isn't a trick in the racketeering bag that the military gang is blind to. It has its finger men to point out enemies, its muscle men to destroy enemies, its brain men to plan war preparations, and a big boss super-nationalistic capitalism. It may seem odd for me, a military man, to adopt such a comparison. Truthfulness compels me to. I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service as a member of this country's most agile military force, the Marine Corps. I served in all commissioned ranks from second lieutenant to major general. And during that period, I spent most of my time being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, and for the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I suspected I was just part of a racket at the time. Now I'm sure of it. Like all the members of the military profession, I never had a thought of my own until I left the service. My mental faculties remained in suspended animation while I obeyed the orders of higher-ups. This is typical with everyone in the military service. I helped make Mexico, especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefits of Wall Street. The record of racketeering is long. I helped purify Nicaragua for the international banking house of Brown Brothers in 1909 to 1912. Where have I heard that name before? I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests in 1916. In China, I helped to see to it that Standard Oil went its way unmolested. During those years, I had, as the boys in the back room would say, a swell racket. Looking back on it, I feel that I could have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was to operate his racket in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents. That's from a speech delivered by retired General Smedley Butler, Major General Smedley Butler, in 1933. And let me close by saying that he did appear before the House Un-American Activities Committee and own up to a lot of this. A lot of it has not been disproven. We've reached the top of the hour. It's 3 p.m. in the East. Thank you for joining us today. I invite you to join us again tomorrow at the Virtual Center. Thank you.